So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Guten Morgen, bonjour, buongiorno, et buondì. We have listeners today from all parts of Switzerland who want to hear about the OECD's analysis of the Swiss economy. We are presenting this year's Economic Survey of Switzerland, which focuses, of course, on the effects of the corona crisis on the Swiss economy, and gives some advice on how the Swiss economy can deal with this, emerge strongly, deal with structural challenges like addressing labor market shortages, boosting productivity, making the best of competition and its embeddedness in the global economy. And I'm very happy to welcome the OECD Secretary General Matthias Cormann, who will present the service's main messages, and Federal Councillor Guy Parmelin, who's the head of the Federal Department of Economic Affairs, Education and Research. And he will comment on the OECD's recommendations from the perspective, of course, of Swiss economic policymaking. Both gentlemen are accompanied by a lady. So I also welcome State Secretary Marie-Gabrielle Ineichen-Fleisch. Bienvenue, Madame. And she's also she's the director of the Department of Economic Affairs, Education and Research. And I also welcome my colleague Isabell Koske, who's a deputy director at the Economics Department of the OECD. But without further ado, Secretary General, I give you the word and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Nicole, dear Federal Councillor Guy Parmelin, Excellencies. It's my real pleasure to be here with you today to launch the 2022 OECD Economic Survey of Switzerland. I would also like to thank the Government of Switzerland, in particular, the Federal Councillor's Office, for the excellent collaboration and the support that we've received during the preparation of this survey. In Switzerland, as of course in many OECD countries and countries all around the world, the pandemic continues to drive uncertainty and to create challenges. Infections started rising steeply again at the end of 2021, and the emergence of the Omicron variant, which is now the predominant variant, has, of course, further clouded prospects for a rapid exit from the pandemic. While the vaccination campaign has accelerated thanks to booster shots, today around 30% of the Swiss population has not yet received a single dose of the vaccine, which is above the percentage achieved in many OECD countries. So improving Switzerland's vaccination rate therefore remains a very high economic policy priority to help ensure a strong, sustainable and sustained recovery. The Swiss economy has been very resilient during the pandemic. After contracting by just 2.5% in 2020, much less than in most other European economies, GDP has recovered to pre-crisis levels in the first half of 2021. And our survey projects that Switzerland's GDP will grow by 3% this year before moderating to 1.8% next year. Competitive global companies, a highly skilled workforce and relatively low reliance, perhaps compared to some more immediate neighbors, on activities most affected by containment measures such as hospitality and entertainment activities, have mitigated the adverse impact of the sanitary measures required to contain the pandemic. And government swiftly introduced extensive fiscal support to sustain incomes and liquidity while also opting for comparatively less strict lockdowns. Switzerland has efficiently mitigated the adverse effect of disruptions in skills provision caused by the temporary closure of schools, training centers or businesses, thanks to the measures being very well targeted. In particular, the expanded short-term work scheme, we believe was helpful in limiting the rise in unemployment and the emergence of scarring effects among more vulnerable groups, such as younger workers, low-paid employees and the like, due to prolonged periods of unemployment or inactivity. Global supply chain disruptions pose a challenge for several segments of the manufacturing sector and have been adversely affecting private investment. Price pressures from supply bottlenecks and high energy prices are also felt in Switzerland, although in Switzerland, compared to other parts of the OECD, inflation remains moderate. Growth in house prices and mortgage loans have remained largely unabated despite the crisis. The mortgage to GDP ratio has continued to grow and is very high by international standards at about 125% compared to an average across the OECD of 47.5%. To better tackle housing market vulnerabilities, we believe Switzerland would benefit from a stronger macro-prudential framework and a broader toolkit of measures that take into account affordability. For instance, through debt to income and debt service to income limits on mortgage loans. And we also suggest that the authorities may want to consider reactivating the counter-cyclical capital buffer targeted at residential mortgage loans. So let me highlight three key messages from the survey focused on optimizing the strength and the quality of the Swiss recovery. First, fiscal and monetary policy should continue to support the economy until the recovery is well underway and uncertainty diminishes, though the challenge is to allow labor and capital reallocation while avoiding scarring effects in terms of future opportunities. So any support measures need to be narrowly targeted towards those households and those sectors of the economy who genuinely still require that support or into future focused investment. Policy action should also ensure that young people acquire the adequate skills to successfully engage in increasingly digitalized economies. The impact of the crisis has differed significantly across sectors, and you can see that on this graph. Activities that are highly dependent on direct contacts, not obviously quite self-evidently face heavy and protracted restrictions, and many remain under pressure, such as accommodation and catering, whereas you can see there that many other parts of the economy have continued to perform strongly, and in fact, even more strongly than prior to the pandemic starting. These disruptions have led to a disproportionate impact on low-skilled and low-wage workers who represent a large share of the workforce in their sectors. So better targeted labor market policies can help displaced workers find new jobs or acquire new skills for more resilient employment. The second priority area, a revival in productivity growth, we believe is also important to sustain the recovery and increases in living standards into the future. Switzerland, no question, is one of the OECD's top performers when it comes to labor productivity. However, if you look at the trend, growth in labor productivity has been comparatively low over the last 3 decades. Raising digital skills across all workers, we believe, will be essential to foster stronger productivity growth moving forward and to respond to labor shortages in growing high productivity businesses such as ICT, startups and firms. Swiss workers, especially younger workers, do have comparably high advanced IT-related skills, but still lag the OECD's top performers. So there is some room for improvement there. There's still barriers to competition within the internal market within Switzerland. This includes comparatively advantaged positions for numerous state-owned enterprises, especially in some activities such as network sectors and at the cantonal level. And some sectors are protected from international competition, notably agriculture and services sectors. Lower barriers to trade and competition and an improved business environment would spur competition and foster investments that would help revive productivity growth. Stability in international agreements and open trade and investment would also help sustain Swiss access to export markets and raise exposure to global competitive pressures, which help to drive improvements in productivity. In particular, sustaining a strong and stable partnership with the European Union would optimize Switzerland's market access and trade opportunities with its main trading partner. Third area of focus, the labor market participation could be boosted across several population segments. Combined with environmentally friendly policies, this would make future growth stronger and more sustainable. Boosting labor market participation can also ensure that those in older age groups have access to employment opportunities. After the statutory retirement age of 65, the otherwise high employment rate in Switzerland declines quite steeply, and more so than for OECD peers. At 25%, the employment rate of men aged between 65 and 69 stands about 5 percentage points below the OECD average. We see a range of disincentives and barriers in the Swiss system that contribute to early retirement and to a comparatively lower uptake of work by older workers. Raising the retirement age and linking it to increases in life expectancy, as well as improving some of the incentives to work beyond 65, are key structural reforms which would help raise revenues and ease spending pressures while helping to sustain growth. Raising future growth also requires a greater labor market participation by women. While on this graph, you can see on one hand that female labor participation at 80% in Switzerland is one of the highest in the OECD, but when you look at it more closely, 45% of Swiss women work part-time, which is significantly higher than the 25% on average across the OECD. With low supply, high costs of childcare facilities contribute to a high uptake of part-time work by women. And I guess that is one of the areas for attention. Work incentives for second earners as part of the tax and benefit system are also comparatively low and reduce labor force participation among women and mothers. And only half of the children between 3 and 5 years old attend early childhood education and care in Switzerland, which compares to an OECD average enrollment rate closer to 90%. Moreover, results from PISA assessments indicate that the gap in reading performance between children from advantaged and disadvantaged backgrounds are higher in Switzerland than in other OECD countries. In that context, improved access to early childhood education would support working mothers and help children from more disadvantaged backgrounds to succeed later in life. On climate, Switzerland has successfully decoupled economic growth from domestic greenhouse gas emissions and material use. The economy's comparatively low carbon intensity stems from high shares of renewable energy resources, nuclear energy, and also, it has to be said, an economy dominated by services. But environmental pressures do remain. A high standard of living, together with a relative lack of domestic raw materials and energy resources, necessitates higher imports, resulting in a significant material footprint per capita, despite relatively low domestic material consumption. New measures to achieve the ambitious net zero emission target by 2050 should therefore be adopted. For example, Switzerland could broaden the base of the carbon tax by reassessing various tax exemptions. There's also room to better align investment portfolios with climate goals and foster eco-innovation. Increasing transparency in relation to the climate compatibility of financial portfolios and strengthening the disclosure of climate-related risks would also help make growth more sustainable. And with that, Cher Guy, distinguished guests, Switzerland remains, of course, a highly successful and globally competitive economy. But even for high performers, there's always further room for improvement. The challenge is to leave the pandemic-related crisis behind and bring about a recovery that is strong, resilient, sustainable, and sustained. And I'm very confident that Switzerland is up to the challenge. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary General, for this overview over the OECD analysis of the Swiss economy. Before I give the word to the Federal Councillor, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping for the Q&A session after that. So journalists in particular, you can ask your questions in the chat. We just ask you to reveal your name and also the medium for which you work. Dear Federal Councillor, Monsieur le Conseiller Fédéral, we are very curious to hear your comments on this presentation.
Merci, thank you, Monsieur le Secrétaire Général, dear Mathias, Mesdames et Messieurs en vos titres et fonctions. Avant toute chose, je me réjouis tout particulièrement que Mathias Cormann, Secrétaire Général de l'OCDE, ait trouvé le temps pour venir commenter la publication de l'étude économique sur la Suisse. Et je tiens aussi à remercier l'OCDE pour son regard extérieur sur notre pays. C'est une contribution qui est bien appréciée et qui est aussi extrêmement utile. Les études économiques de l'OCDE contribuent ainsi à notre travail permanent d'identifier le besoin d'action en matière de politique économique. Et cette analyse peut fournir des indications et des idées précieuses qui ne seraient peut-être pas avancées par les experts suisses directement impliqués ou qui sont connus, mais politiquement disputés. Il est naturel que ce regard extérieur puisse parfois interpeller, car l'évaluation de l'OCDE ne correspond pas nécessairement aux vues qui prévalent en Suisse. De plus, les forces et les faiblesses de la place économique suisse sont ainsi chaque fois placées dans le contexte international et comparées à celles d'autres pays. Cela peut également donner de bonnes indications sur la situation et la performance en Suisse. Permettez-moi de revenir brièvement sur quelques points importants de l'étude économique actuelle sur la Suisse par l'OCDE. Le rapport salue la gestion de la pandémie du Covid-19 par la Suisse. L'économie et le marché du travail se sont montrés résistants durant la crise en comparaison internationale et cela peut s'expliquer entre autres par des restrictions sanitaires moins strictes que dans certains pays. L'OCDE souligne également que les mesures généreuses d'atténuation prises par l'État ont joué un rôle prépondérant pour aider l'économie à traverser la crise. Et selon l'OCDE, la Suisse dispose également d'entreprises, de branches compétitives au niveau mondial, ainsi que de bonnes conditions cadres en matière de politique économique. Tout cela s'est traduit par un ralentissement économique moins important en comparaison avec d'autres pays de l'OCDE. Naturellement, en tant que ministre de l'économie, il m'est bien sûr réjouissant d'entendre que nous avons manifestement su prendre les bonnes décisions, mais il est aussi clair que la crise n'est malheureusement pas encore terminée. La vague actuelle ainsi que le nouveau variant du virus l'ont bien montré. Et je crois qu'il est aussi important de souligner que certains domaines et entreprises ont été beaucoup plus touchés par la crise que d'autres. C'est le cas, par exemple, chez nous du domaine du tourisme et de l'événementiel. Selon l'OCDE, le défi consiste maintenant à continuer à soutenir les branches fortement touchées par la crise et les groupes de personnes vulnérables sans pour autant retarder les changements structurels de l'économie. Ainsi, l'OCDE recommande de continuer à accorder un soutien étatique là où c'est nécessaire, mais de le restreindre de plus en plus en accord avec la levée des restrictions sanitaires. L'OCDE signale aussi que le maintien prolongé d'aides publiques trop généreuses pourrait avoir pour conséquence de maintenir artificiellement en vie des entreprises non viables et de priver celles qui le sont de précieuses ressources, entravant ainsi la hausse de la productivité et la reprise. Concrètement, l'OCDE recommande que les entreprises participent à nouveau davantage à l'indemnité en cas de réduction de l'horaire de travail via le délai de carence, et ceci dès que la plupart des restrictions sanitaires auront été levées. Le Conseil fédéral suit la ligne préconisée par l'OCDE. En effet, il avait réintroduit un délai de carence d'1 jour à la 2021, et ce n'est que face à la récente vague de pandémie qu'il s'est résolu à réintroduire cet allègement pour les entreprises, mais pour une durée limitée de 3 mois. La forte vague récente de la pandémie a également incité le Parlement suisse et le Conseil fédéral à proposer différentes extensions de l'indemnisation du chômage partiel, mais nous avons cependant veillé à ce que ces dernières restent extrêmement ciblées et surtout limitées dans le temps. Nous sommes d'accord avec l'OCDE pour dire que nous devons revenir à nos règles initiales dès que la situation le permet. Si les travailleurs perdent malgré tout leur emploi, l'assurance chômage aide les personnes concernées à se réinsérer sur le marché du travail et à maintenir leurs revenus. Et pour accompagner la reprise économique, le Conseil fédéral a en outre décidé de mettre en place un programme de relance pour le tourisme et aussi d'étendre temporairement la promotion de l'innovation pour les petites et moyennes entreprises. Et dans une perspective à plus long terme, l'OCDE estime en outre qu'une exploitation meilleure encore du potentiel de main-d'œuvre soutiendrait la reprise économique et contribuerait à l'augmentation de la productivité. Les femmes, les travailleurs âgés pourraient donc ainsi être encore mieux intégrés sur le marché du travail. C'est dans ce contexte que l'OCDE recommande notamment à la Suisse de fixer l'âge ordinaire de départ à la retraite à 65 ans pour les hommes comme pour les femmes et de l'adapter à l'augmentation de l'espérance de vie et de renforcer les incitations à l'activité professionnelle dans le système fiscal et d'améliorer encore l'accès à l'accueil extra-familial des enfants. Tous ces points font actuellement, pour la plupart, l'objet de discussions intensives en Suisse et certains même sont actuellement traités au Parlement. Je ne peux naturellement pas résumer et discuter toutes les recommandations de l'OCDE ici, mais croyez-moi que nous les étudions et nous consulterons aussi plus profondément dans les temps qui vont venir prochainement. En conclusion, le point de vue extérieur émis par l'OCDE nous montre que nous sommes sur le bon chemin dans de nombreux domaines, que nous avons posé les bons jalons, et ceci notamment durant la crise. Mais l'analyse nous montre également que la Suisse doit maintenir le cap tout en s'attaquant aux réformes nécessaires afin de relever avec succès les défis actuels en matière de politique économique. Encore une fois, merci à l'OCDE pour son excellente analyse de la politique économique et de la politique de lutte contre la pandémie en Suisse. J'en ai terminé et je vous rends la parole. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Conseiller fédéral. So we can now answer question and answer session. You can ask your questions to the Secretary General and also to the Federal Councillor. As I said, please give us your name and your institutions for which you work. I have one first question from André Lehmann of AWP Finanznachrichten. Perhaps you could react first, Secretary General. He's asking about inflation and rising energy prices and to which extent this should determine the fiscal policy support, and I assume it's withdrawal. How do you see that?
Well, we don't see a uniform situation when it comes to inflation across the world. And when you look at Switzerland in particular, while inflation has increased, it is comparatively moderate. It's sitting at below 2%. I mean, we believe that Switzerland has still got significant fiscal capacity and also significant fiscal capacity and capacity in the economy to absorb that additional support that is provided. But as I've said in my presentation, support should be narrowly targeted to those sectors and to those households who genuinely still need that support, and also towards a future-focused investment. So, I mean, with inflation, with energy price rises, it's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
Councillor, Monsieur Guy Parmelin. It comes from Matteo Yanni, journaliste de l'AGFI. Et son question, c'est donc le ministre des Finances Ueli Maura a déclaré dans la presse récemment que son objectif minimal est de disposer assez rapidement d'une base légale qui garantira que la dette accumulée pendant la pandémie sera remboursée. Or, l'OCDE, dans son rapport, observe qu'un resserrement budgétaire prématuré pourrait compromettre la reprise, devrait donc être évité. Que répondez-vous, monsieur le conseiller fédéral?
Oui, merci pour la question. Je crois que le Conseil fédéral est parfaitement conscient de ceci, y compris monsieur Maurer. Nous avons eu déjà certaines discussions à la fin de l'année passée, mais nous voulions attendre la fin de ce premier trimestre, particulièrement le département des finances, pour avoir la meilleure des visions possible sur l'état de la situation. Et naturellement, le Conseil fédéral va discuter certainement de différentes variantes pour, conformément à notre système, vous savez que nous avons le fameux frein à l'endettement, pour pouvoir entamer une stratégie de remboursement en tenant compte des remarques de l'OCDE qui ne viserait pas, naturellement, qui n'aurait pas pour conséquence de casser ou de briser les reins, si vous passez l'expression, à la reprise de la croissance. Donc, cet exercice va avoir lieu. Nous attendons encore quelques mois pour avoir le bilan général, mais nous sommes conscients qu'il faudra être extrêmement prudent.
Merci beaucoup. And I have another question from Servan Pekka. He's from Journal Le Temps. And he's asking, it's perhaps mostly a question to you, Secretary General. He's asking about, so we've discussed that you can also go too long for supporting labor or employment, sorry, with Kurzarbeit, chômage partiel. And he wants to know, how can you identify the jobs that you shouldn't support too long? Which are the ones that are not structurally viable? And what are the instruments to identify these jobs where at some point you should stop?
Well, in a free and open market economy, it is the market that determines which businesses have a viable and profitable future. And in the context of the pandemic and when the crisis first hit, economies around the world provided blanket emergency support as was appropriate. But of course, we're now in a situation where we understand the impact and the dynamics surrounding the pandemic much better. We have significant risk management tools in place. And indeed, I mean, significant parts of the economy have fully recovered and are now performing even more strongly than before the pandemic. So it's really a matter of limiting public policy intervention to those sectors that manifestly are still suffering. And one of the graphs in the presentation earlier was very striking. I mean, clearly, the accommodation sector is one that is still very heavily impacted. It's quite obvious. Other sectors are clearly not impacted any longer and are performing well. And in those sectors, the normal operation of the market should be allowed to determine which businesses and hence which jobs have a viable and strong future.
Thank you very much. And there's another question for you. So it comes from Uli Hoch of AWP, and he's asking, do you see the strong Swiss franc as a danger for the Swiss economy?
Well, look, the Swiss economy is a strong economy, but the Swiss economy is an open trading economy. And there are automatic stabilizers that adjust, in the ordinary course of events. And I'm not, in the end, the value is set by the market.
That's right. So for the moment, we don't have further questions from journalists. Perhaps I can take, waiting whether there more will come, I can take one or two questions that come from the general public. So there's somebody called Randall has been asked, so how do we still expect inflation to be transitory? So there's some signs that this could be the case, but it could be, there could be a spiral, right? A wage inflation spiral. So how should we observe this phenomenon, Secretary General, perhaps in the first instance?
Well, I mean, in terms of inflation, I mean, yes, inflation is rising around the world, and it has risen in Switzerland. But I mean, if you look at Switzerland, inflation, as I mentioned before, remains moderate. It remains within the target range. It remains below 2%. Long-term inflation expectations, we believe, are firmly anchored. And certainly for Switzerland, the OECD expects inflation to remain moderate and to subside from current levels over the next 2 years. And yes, I mean, there is steady pressure on the Swiss franc to appreciate, exerting additional downward pressure on inflation. So pressure towards appreciation from capital inflows in particular become, not surprisingly, more acute in times of global crisis. As the Swiss franc, one of the advantages and I guess associated challenges is that Swiss franc is very much perceived as a safe haven currency, and that has some consequences. But given all of that, and given continued uncertainty around the coronavirus crisis, we do believe that monetary policy should remain accommodative, and at the same time, though, macroprudential and supervisory policies should be and can be further strengthened to counter some of the rising imbalances in the housing market and risks in the financial sector. Now, in terms of inflation, more generally in other parts of the world, well, in different parts of the world, different policy responses will be required depending on what is driving it.
Thank you very much. And I have a follow-up question from Servant Pekka of Le Temps. He was asking the question, il a demandé cette question sur le chômage partiel et comment identifier les jobs qu'il ne faut pas soutenir trop longtemps. Ils aimeraient bien aussi entendre votre réponse, monsieur le conseiller fédéral.
Oui, merci. Les règles du chômage partiel sont extrêmement précises et les conditions sont précises. C'est extrêmement difficile de pouvoir identifier particulièrement les secteurs qui doivent être soutenus et jusqu'à un certain point. Nous avons différents systèmes. Nous avons les règles de chômage partiel, elles sont valables pour tout le monde. Et puis nous avons un système d'aide complémentaire. Il y a eu ce qu'on a appelé les prêts Covid. Ceci est terminé. Et puis nous avons les aides dites pour les cas de rigueur. Et là, les conditions sont aussi définies d'entente avec les cantons. Nous sommes actuellement sur mandat du Parlement en train de finaliser l'ordonnance sur la nouvelle série des aides ciblées, des aides pour cas de rigueur. Et là, nous avons des limites qui sont fixées par le Parlement et la marge de manœuvre du Conseil fédéral n'est pas très grande. Pour le chômage partiel, dès que les conditions vont s'alléger, je l'ai dit, dès que les conditions sanitaires, les restrictions sanitaires vont se lever, nous voulons revenir le plus rapidement à une situation normale, mais ça c'est valable pour tout le monde, avec la réintroduction du délai de carence, par exemple. Tout ceci fait partie de la stratégie et va dans le sens de ce que l'OCDE nous recommande.
Explicitement de Jan Baumann, Radio SFR. Il demande quelles sont pour vous les recommandations de l'OCDE qui sont prioritaires pour vous?
Alors, il y en a beaucoup de prioritaires, mais dans l'objectif, il faut se projeter aussi dans le futur. Et ce qui est intéressant pour nous, c'est par exemple les remarques que l'OCDE a faites, et on a vu le schéma présenté par monsieur Cormann, où finalement la capacité de croissance est plus modérée que les années, les décades précédentes. Ça veut dire qu'on est moins bon quelque part. Ça veut dire qu'il faut essayer de faire disparaître certains obstacles, de faciliter l'économie, le rôle de l'économie. Et dans ce sens-là, par exemple, une des mesures qui avait été prônée, qui va être mise en œuvre, c'est l'abolition des droits de douane sur les tarifs industriels. C'était une recommandation. Le Parlement, après de très, très longues discussions, a accepté ce projet. Maintenant, nous sommes en train de préparer la suite. C'est un allègement sur le plan administratif, donc des obstacles techniques. C'est une économie au niveau des différentes entreprises industrielles. Donc, c'est davantage de marge de manœuvre et ça donnera aussi un boost, si vous passez l'expression, pour investir dans le futur. Grosso modo, c'est environ 900 millions de francs suisses qui vont, le moment venu, être bénéficiaires pour la place économique suisse. Le budget fédéral étant amputé de 500 millions. Voilà, par exemple, un exemple. Et puis, nous allons venir proposer une loi sur les allègements administratifs, parce que nous voyons aussi que, et c'est une demande récurrente des milieux de l'économie, les empreintes et les contraintes administratives sont extrêmement élevées et coûteuses. Et là, ça sera un débat extrêmement animé, je suppose, au Parlement.
Merci beaucoup. Et si je peux me permettre, ça fait plaisir de voir que les recommandations de l'OCDE ont un impact, visiblement. And the follow-up question, Secretary General, is very fitting in some ways to what the Federal Councillor just said. So Fabian Pöschel of 20 Minutes is asking you, you said, Mr. Cormann, that Switzerland has room to improve its productivity, and how can that be done? What are the main levers?
Well, I touched on this during the presentation. I mean, you know, essentially continue to expose all sectors of the economy to competition. I mean, there's some restrictions, you know, even within Switzerland's internal markets, in between cantons, where there's opportunity to free up, you know, and where there are advantages given to specific cantonal public businesses or publicly owned businesses. And you know, if there is broader exposure to open markets internally and externally, you know, we believe that that will help optimize the level of productivity growth that can be achieved out of the Swiss economy.
Yeah, perfect. And there is, thank you very much. And Uli Hoch of AWP has again a question for you. He's asking, given the very high reserves of the Swiss National Bank, do you think it would be good, should the bank have a sovereign wealth fund to manage these reserves? Do you have a view on that?
Well, look, I have not got a settled view on this, and I'm just not going to weigh into this without having thought about that.
Okay, fair enough. The way I can see it, for the moment, we don't have journalist questions. We do have a little bit of time, so I'll take one or two more from the general public. Peut-être une question pour vous, monsieur le conseiller fédéral. Il y a une dame qui demande, donc on a parlé du relativement faible taux d'emploi des travailleurs un peu âgés, et demande s'il y a une loi contre la discrimination des travailleurs âgés, si ça pourrait aider leur intégration dans le marché du travail. Est-ce que c'est quelque chose qui est considéré en ce moment?
Nous avons différentes réflexions en cours, différentes aussi mesures, et je crois que ça figure dans le rapport aussi de l'OCDE, pour, sur le plan fiscal, essayer d'éviter de discriminer ou de décourager ou d'avoir des mauvaises incitations pour l'activité des personnes âgées. En l'état, nous nous concentrons aussi surtout sur des mesures permettant d'intégrer, de maintenir aussi les personnes au-delà de 50-55 ans sur le marché du travail, parce que quand elles perdent leur emploi, elles ont beaucoup plus de peine à le retrouver, et d'intégrer encore davantage, c'est aussi une recommandation de l'OCDE, les femmes sur le marché du travail, et ça passe par différentes mesures, le soutien à des infrastructures pour la garde des enfants, par exemple. Nous avons vu que les coûts sont extrêmement élevés. Avec les cantons, la Confédération avait initié un programme d'impulsion pour des crèches et garderies qui a été déjà renouvelé 3 fois, sauf erreur. Et je pense qu'ici, il y a encore un potentiel à exploiter.
Très bien, merci beaucoup. So, and given that I don't see further questions in the chat for the moment, I would like to thank you, Secretary General, and you, Federal Councillor, Madame State Secretary Ineichen-Fleisch. You haven't talked, but you've supported us. And Isabell Koske, thank you very much for this presentation. And yeah, it has been a pleasure, and I wish you everybody a very good day.
Merci beaucoup. Bonne journée. Merci.
Bonne journée.